At some point, searching for a new job stopped feeling like a step forward and started feeling like a roll of the dice. It is no longer about chasing a dream role or reinventing yourself. For many people, it is just the basic act of opening a laptop, refreshing a resume, and hoping to make incremental progress. And yet, for a growing share of Americans, even that simple step now feels draining before it even begins. This shift is not happening because people suddenly lost their work ethic or ambition. It is happening because the job market no longer feels like a place where effort reliably leads to results. What we are seeing is not just a discussion about wages or motivation. It is a breakdown in trust. A quiet labor market confidence crisis that is changing how people behave long before it shows up in official headlines. From a distance, everything can appear relatively calm. The unemployment rate still hovers around 4.4%, a number often used to signal stability. But lived experience tells a very different story, and the distance between those two realities is widening. A large national survey revealed that only 43% of workers say they plan to actively look for a new job in 2026. Just a year earlier, that number was an astonishing 93%. That is not a minor adjustment. That is a psychological shift. A line has been crossed, and once that happens, the entire system downstream starts to behave differently. Hiring can cool without triggering an official recession. Layoffs can feel relentless, even when they happen unevenly across industries. Side hustles stop being about passion or extra income and become a necessary buffer against instability. Even the gig economy, long seen as a fallback option, begins to tighten quietly, often noticed only when weekly earnings start shrinking. In this video, we are going to unpack what the data actually shows beneath the surface. Why hiring momentum has faded, how underemployment hides in plain sight, and why so many workers already feel burned out before the year has even fully started. So why are so many people opting out before they even begin the search? That question sits at the center of what is happening right now, and the answer has very little to do with laziness or entitlement. It has everything to do with exhaustion. For years, workers were told a consistent story. Stay flexible. Keep applying. Be willing to relocate, reskill, or pivot. And opportunities will eventually show up. During strong economic periods, that belief held true. Switching jobs often meant higher pay, better benefits, and improved working conditions. But that promise has quietly unraveled. Recent survey data makes this clear. More than half of workers now expect layoffs to rise over the next year. Around 40% believe the job market will deteriorate further, while another 40% think conditions will simply stagnate. That leaves almost no space for optimism. And when people stop believing the environment is improving, they stop acting as if effort will pay off. This is where the mental break occurs. Looking for a job is not just time-consuming. It is emotionally expensive. It demands hope. You rewrite your resume, believing someone will actually read it. You submit applications assuming the posting reflects a real opening. You prepare for interviews trusting the role will still exist by the time decisions are made. When those assumptions erode, the cost of trying begins to outweigh the potential upside. As a result, the central question shifts. Instead of asking how to move ahead, people start asking how to avoid making things worse. Staying in a role that barely keeps pace with inflation can feel safer than risking unemployment. Even when pay is falling behind, predictability starts to matter more than progress. This is why so many workers remain in place, not because they are content, but because uncertainty feels more dangerous than stagnation. This change in behavior also explains why traditional labor market signals can be misleading. When fewer people are willing to search or switch jobs, hiring naturally slows. Job openings receive fewer qualified applicants, not because demand vanished, but because confidence did. On the surface, the system appears calmer. Underneath, pressure continues to build. Once people decide that job searching is no longer worth the emotional toll, they do not just pause briefly, they adjust their entire strategy. That adaptation is what creates the illusion of stability dominating the headlines today. The illusion becomes clearer when the numbers are examined more closely. Yes, the unemployment rate remains in the mid 4% range, and that figure is often treated as a shorthand for labor market health. But unemployment only captures one narrow condition. It counts people who are actively looking for work and cannot find it. It does not include those who want more hours, greater stability, or better pay, but no longer believe the search is worth the risk. That gap is where the real strain exists. Millions of workers are classified as part-time for economic reasons, meaning they want full-time work but cannot get it or have had their hours reduced. At the same time, millions more say they want a job but are not counted as unemployed because they stopped actively searching. Once they step back, they disappear from the headline data entirely. This is how a labor market can feel fragile even when the statistics look controlled. Hiring has slowed sharply, confidence has eroded, and all of it is happening without the clarity of a formal recession label. Over the last year, employment growth has slowed to the point where it is barely keeping up with population increases. Job creation that once felt steady and predictable has thinned out, turning monthly gains into something that feels increasingly rare. Positions still exist, but the pace at which people are moving into them has narrowed significantly. Employers are hesitant. Workers are hesitant. As a result, movement across the labor market grinds down. This is where the idea of a hiring recession starts to feel accurate. Not as a sudden collapse or dramatic downturn, but as a quiet standstill. When companies slow their hiring, changing jobs becomes more difficult. When changing jobs becomes more difficult, workers hold tightly to their current positions. And once that happens, the entire system stiffens. Fewer openings circulate. Fewer people quit. Fewer opportunities exist to reset wages upward through mobility. The labor market technically continues to operate, but it loses its sense of motion. It functions, but it no longer feels alive. This is not what recessions traditionally looked like. There is no single shock event, no rapid surge in unemployment that dominates headlines overnight. Instead, there is a gradual tightening that rewards caution and penalizes risk. That kind of environment reshapes behavior long before it shows up in official statistics. And as hiring activity slows, another internal force begins to reshape the job market in a more lasting way. That force is restructuring. This wave of change looks very different from past layoff cycles. In earlier downturns, job cuts were often framed as temporary measures tied to declining demand. When conditions improved, hiring typically followed. This time, the story is shifting. Companies are not just trimming expenses. They are rethinking how work itself is done. Across many industries, layoffs are increasingly connected to investments in automation and artificial intelligence. Entire categories of roles are quietly disappearing. Jobs centered on coordination, administrative oversight, and internal process management are being reduced or eliminated. Not because workers failed to perform, but because software systems now handle tasks that once required full teams. What makes this shift unsettling is not just the scale, but the direction it is moving. Publicly announced job cuts exceeded 1 million over the past year, a sharp jump compared to the previous period. An increasing portion of those cuts explicitly referenced automation or AI as a contributing factor. That distinction matters. Cost reductions can be reversed when conditions improve. Structural replacement rarely is. For workers, this changes how layoffs are perceived. Losing a job no longer feels like a temporary interruption. It feels like displacement. When a role is eliminated because technology replaces it, there is no assurance that a comparable position exists elsewhere. Even when people find new work, it often comes with lower pay, reduced stability, or a forced shift into an entirely different field. This reality feeds directly back into behavior. Workers who remain employed feel constant pressure to adapt. They are expected to learn new systems, absorb additional responsibilities, and continuously prove their relevance beyond their original job scope. The message is rarely stated outright, but it is widely understood. Keep up, or risk becoming replaceable. At the same time, those who have already been laid off face a harsher job market. Openings are fewer, hiring timelines are longer. Competition for each role is more intense. Even highly qualified candidates struggle to make it past automated screening systems. Searching for work becomes an exhausting cycle with declining returns. This is why layoffs feel more demoralizing now than in previous periods. It is not only the loss of income, it is the growing sense that stable career paths themselves are eroding. As that perception spreads, workers adjust once again. When traditional advancement feels unreliable, people start looking for alternatives. Not because they prefer them, but because they need a sense of control. That is how side hustles and multiple job holding shift from optional strategies to necessities. Initially, taking on extra work feels like a practical response. When wages fall behind, rising costs, and job mobility stalls, adding another income source seems like the safest option available. Many workers tell themselves it is temporary, a short-term sacrifice to create financial breathing room without jeopardizing their main job. That framing matters, because it obscures what is really happening. Holding multiple jobs is no longer limited to people chasing ambitious financial goals. It is increasingly concentrated among workers trying to cover basic expenses. A growing share of people juggle two or more roles not to get ahead, but simply to avoid slipping backward. On the surface, this looks like hustle culture. In reality, it is a form of risk management under pressure. What often goes unspoken is the cost of this adaptation. Working multiple jobs stretches time to the breaking point. Rest becomes scarce. Schedules grow unpredictable. Benefits tied to full-time employment do not expand just because total hours increase, and the margin for error shrinks dramatically. One missed shift or one unexpected bill can destabilize the entire setup. This is where the side hustle narrative begins to fracture. For years, the gig economy was marketed as freedom. Work when you want. Earn extra on your own terms. But flexibility only feels empowering when the income is reliable and sufficient. When it is not, flexibility starts to look less like freedom and more like fragility. As more workers turn to gig platforms out of necessity rather than choice, the math of that work starts to break down. More people chasing the same pool of tasks means tighter competition and shrinking payouts. What once provided a meaningful income boost now barely covers gas, vehicle maintenance, or the value of the time spent. In many cases, the pressure does not come from obvious pay cuts. It comes from changes workers never directly see. Small interface updates, subtle adjustments to payment timing, or algorithm changes can quietly reduce earnings without ever touching the advertised rates. Workers notice the result in their weekly totals, but are rarely told why it happened. The tasks are the same, the hours look unchanged, but the money no longer adds up. This creates a second layer of instability. Not only does the primary job feel uncertain, but the fallback option becomes unreliable as well. When both the main source of income and the backup plan feel fragile at the same time, the mental toll compounds quickly. Long-term planning fades. Goals shrink. Financial decisions become reactive instead of strategic. The focus shifts from building stability to simply getting through the next week. This is the point where a labor market issue becomes a household resilience crisis. And the effects do not stop at the individual level. When large numbers of people rely on income streams that can change overnight, even minor disruptions ripple outward. A shift in consumer habits, a regulatory update, a platform redesign. Each one lands harder when households no longer have a buffer. What appears to be personal hustle is, in reality, a system under strain. To see how exposed that system has become, you only need to look at what unfolded in one of the most expensive cities in the country. That vulnerability became impossible to ignore once data from New York City started to surface. For many workers, delivery apps represent the final safety valve. When hours are cut or a primary job stalls, driving or delivering food feels like something you can activate instantly. No interview, no waiting period. Just log in and start earning. At least, That is the promise. What actually happened tells a different story. Recent figures showed that the average tip on food delivery orders in New York City dropped to just $0.76. 2 years earlier, that average was closer to $3.66. This was not a slow decline. It happened rapidly, and it had little to do with effort, service quality, or worker performance. The cause was design. Delivery platforms quietly moved the tipping prompt from before checkout to after the order was completed. That single interface change dramatically altered customer behavior. When tipping required an extra step after payment, most customers simply skipped it. Worker earnings fell almost overnight. For delivery workers, tips are not extra. They are often the majority of take-home pay. When that portion disappears, the job stops making sense financially. The hours did not change. The distances stayed the same, but weekly income dropped to levels that made the work unsustainable. At the same time, policy changes introduced another layer of complexity. New York City implemented higher minimum pay standards for delivery workers. On paper, this looked like protection, and in some respects, it was. Base pay increased. But the unintended outcome was predictable. As delivery fees rose, customers became less likely to tip. Many assumed workers were already being compensated fairly. The result was not a net gain, but a shift. Higher guaranteed pay offset by lower variable income. From the worker's perspective, the outcome felt familiar. Less flexibility, less upside, more uncertainty. This moment is revealing because the gig economy is often described as a pressure release valve for the labor market. When traditional jobs falter, people are expected to flow into flexible work. But that valve only works if the system can absorb the volume. When too many people depend on it at once, and when earnings hinge on fragile behavioral cues, it stops functioning as a safety net. Instead, it becomes another point of failure. What happened in New York City is not an isolated case. It is simply more visible. It shows how quickly supplemental income can evaporate when incentives change. It also exposes how little control workers have over the platforms they rely on. When backup income becomes unpredictable, the margin for error at the household level disappears entirely. That pressure does not exist in isolation. It stacks on top of another force people feel every single week: the cost of basic necessities. Even as income becomes less reliable, the minimum required spending remains stubbornly high. This is where the squeeze tightens next. The strain becomes unavoidable when you look at what households must pay just to maintain a basic standard of living. Food is where the pressure shows up first, because food cannot be delayed or negotiated. You cannot postpone it. You cannot cut it out entirely. You feel it week after week. And over the past year, that burden has quietly intensified in ways that are easy to underestimate. According to government analysis, the average household spent roughly $310 more on groceries in 2025 than in 2024. By itself, that increase does not sound alarming. It does not immediately register as a crisis or a breaking point. On paper, it looks manageable. But that perspective misses how the pressure actually built. The higher cost did not arrive in one dramatic jump that forced households to react all at once. Instead, it crept in slowly, through countless small increases spread across ordinary purchases. Coffee edged higher again. Ground beef became noticeably more expensive. Eggs never quite returned to their old price. Each grocery trip felt only slightly worse than the one before, until one day it clearly wasn't. That is where the strain becomes psychological rather than purely financial. Food costs are different from most other expenses. Rent usually resets once a year. Insurance premiums follow a schedule. Utility bills fluctuate within a predictable range. Groceries, by contrast, confront you constantly. Every checkout total becomes a reminder that prices are higher than they used to be, and that relief may never come. Even when overall inflation slows, food prices rarely fall back. They simply stop rising as quickly. From a household perspective, that still feels like losing ground. As a result, Grocery spending starts competing with categories it never used to challenge. Savings, debt payments, transportation. For households already operating with little margin, there is no unused category left to cut. Something else has to give. And what usually disappears first is flexibility. This is why so many people feel trapped even when the numbers sound modest. $300 over a year does not seem dramatic in isolation. Spread across weekly shopping trips, it quietly eats away at breathing room. It forces households into decisions that feel small but accumulate over time. Switching to cheaper brands, skipping items altogether, stretching meals, putting groceries on credit cards that were once reserved for emergencies. Over time, these adjustments change behavior in deeper ways. When essential costs rise while income feels uncertain, people stop planning for progress and start planning for survival. Budgets become defensive. Decisions shrink to the short term. The goal shifts from getting ahead to simply avoiding another setback. That shift is subtle, but it matters. It signals that the system is no longer rewarding effort in a way people can feel or trust. This is not a story about poor choices or excess spending. It is about a breakdown in the relationship between work and stability. When basic necessities keep getting more expensive while income options narrow, the sense of payoff erodes. That is why this moment feels so heavy. It is not just that groceries cost more. It is that higher costs are arriving in a labor market where job mobility has slowed, backup income has weakened, and resilience has already been stretched thin. At that point, the issue stops being inflation alone. It becomes a broader loss of confidence. The belief that effort leads to security starts to collapse. What we are watching is not a sudden economic crash. It is a slow recalibration that changes behavior long before it shows up in official labels. Hiring has cooled without a declared recession. Underemployment has expanded without driving unemployment sharply higher. And the fallback options people once relied on, side gigs and flexible work, have grown less dependable. At the same time, the cost of essentials remains elevated. Together, these forces explain why so many workers feel stuck, even when headline numbers suggest stability. This is the real warning sign. When effort no longer feels connected to progress, people adapt in predictable ways. They take fewer risks. They stop switching jobs. They accept arrangements that offer security but little upside. Over time, that behavior reshapes the entire labor market from the inside out. That is the reality of the hiring slowdown people are living through, whether it is officially acknowledged or not. Looking ahead, the most important takeaway is not panic, but clarity. Understanding how the U.S. job market is evolving in 2026 allows households to make decisions with open eyes instead of outdated expectations. This moment is not just about unemployment rates. It is about whether work still functions as a reliable path to stability. Which part of this experience feels most familiar to you? The stalled job search, the pressure on side income, or the rising cost of everyday basics? If this breakdown helped you see what is really happening beneath the surface, subscribe so you're prepared for what comes next.